Mocked by aliens. The human recruit proved what true strength is at HFY, Sci-Fi stories. The Galactic Council chamber was abuzz with alien voices as the representatives from countless species argued among themselves. Their languages, strange and varied, filled the room with a cacophony of sound. But amidst the sea of advanced beings, one figure stood out. It was a human, a young recruit named David Miller, chosen to represent Earth in the Interspecies Military Coalition. It had been a week since his arrival, and David had already faced the skepticism of the Council. His species, Earthlings, were a young and relatively weak race in the grand scale of galactic civilization. The aliens, with their centuries of advanced technology and towering physiques, saw humanity as little more than an amusing curiosity. But David was determined to show them that Earthlings were more than what they assumed. Human. A tall, insectoid creature named Zalrith hissed from across the table. Its multiple eyes glowed menacingly, and its voice was filled with condescension. Your species is weak. Your technology is primitive. Your body's frail. You have no place among us. How could you possibly stand a chance in the galactic war against the Zinther Empire? David stood up, unfazed by the taunts. The room went silent, all eyes now on the human. I'll show you, he said calmly. Give me a chance, and I'll prove that strength isn't always measured by size or power. The council murmured, some of them chuckling, while others regarded him with bemusement. Zalrith leaned forward, its mandibles clicking in amusement. A challenge then, the insectoid said with a sneer. A battle. We'll see if your strength is enough to match our might. David's heart raced, but his expression remained stoic. He knew the odds were stacked against him. The Zinther Empire was a ruthless force, and their soldiers were formidable, towering creatures with immense strength and advanced weaponry. Yet, David had something they didn't, the indomitable human spirit. I accept, David said, his voice steady. The council agreed to the terms. David would face off against a Zinther soldier in a combat simulation, a holographic battle arena where he could fight without risk to his life. The simulation would be designed to test every aspect of combat: strength, endurance, agility, and tactics. The day of the challenge arrived. David stood at the center of the arena, his heart pounding, sweat beading on his forehead. The Zinther soldier, a massive beast with dark purple scales and razor-sharp claws, loomed across from him. The creature towered over him, at least 7 feet tall, and radiated an aura of brutal power. You're going to die, human, the Zinther growled. David didn't respond. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to prove a point. The simulation began, and the Zinther soldier charged, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. David dodged to the side, barely avoiding the attack. The alien's power was undeniable, but David's mind worked faster. He wasn't the strongest or the biggest, but he was quick, resourceful, and determined. The Zinther soldier was relentless, its attacks growing more ferocious. But David, using his agility and ingenuity, was able to stay one step ahead. He ducked under a massive swing, then used the momentum of the Zinther's strike to land a solid blow to its side. The creature roared in anger, swinging wildly, but David was already gone, back in motion. Minutes passed, and the alien grew frustrated. It was used to crushing its opponents with sheer strength. But David wasn't going to make that easy. He kept his distance, exploiting the alien's overconfidence, waiting for an opening. Finally, it came. The Zinther made a mistake, a moment of hesitation, and David capitalized on it. With a swift move, David dodged to the side and used a piece of debris to trip the Zinther, sending it crashing to the ground. Before it could recover, he was on top of it, pinning its arms with a well-placed strike to its shoulders, utilizing his opponent's own momentum against it. The simulation paused, and the holograms flickered out. The Zinther was defeated. David stood over the creature, breathing heavily, his muscles sore from the intense exertion. The room was silent for a moment. Then the aliens began to murmur in disbelief. Zalrith, who had been mocking David only moments before, stared in stunned silence. You actually defeated it," Zalrith said, its voice barely a whisper. David wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to face the council. "Strength is more than just physical power," he said. "It's about willpower, intelligence, and the ability to adapt. You think you're better than humans because of your size and technology, But I've shown you something that none of you have considered, heart. The council was silent. For the first time, they were forced to confront the undeniable truth that the human species had something special, something they could no longer ignore. David's victory was a turning point. From that day forward, humanity was no longer seen as weak. They were seen as a force to be reckoned with, and David Miller became a symbol of the strength that lay within every human, a strength that no alien, no matter how powerful, could ever truly understand. In the end, it wasn't the aliens' might or their advanced technology that won the war against the Zinther Empire. It was humanity's courage, ingenuity, and relentless spirit. And it all started with one human recruit proving what true strength really is. Mocked by aliens, the human recruit proved what true strength is. A HFY, Sci-Fi Stories, Part 2. David Miller's victory in the simulation quickly became a legend. His name echoed across the galaxy, from the thriving colonies of the Aldrin Expanse to the bustling trade hubs of the Rarvan Reach. It was whispered in bars and military training halls, with humans everywhere taking pride in what David had accomplished. But while the story was one of victory, it was only the beginning of the true test. The Zinther Empire was not an enemy that could be easily defeated by a single victory. Its influence stretched far across the galaxy, and their relentless, brutal campaigns had left countless worlds in ruin. But the Council of Species that had once ridiculed humanity was now paying attention. And they realized that perhaps the answer to the Zinther threat wasn't their advanced weaponry or vast fleets, it was the human resolve. A few months after David's trial by combat, the Galactic Council convened once again. This time, it wasn't just to discuss military strategy. The stakes were much higher. The Zinther had launched a full-scale offensive, sweeping through neutral territories at an alarming pace. Even the most powerful races, such as the towering Vorak or the energy-based Phylaxians, were struggling to defend against their overwhelming numbers. Desperation hung in the air as each species scrambled for answers. And so, the Council made a bold decision. They would unite their forces under one banner, to fight not just for their survival, but for the survival of the entire galaxy. The human race, though untested in battle, was granted a seat at the table, a gesture made in part because of David's shocking performance. Humanity's representatives were tasked with leading a new, experimental strike force. David was chosen to command this ragtag army of different species, not because of his combat prowess, but because of the same qualities that had made him successful in the arena: his leadership, his intellect, and his understanding of the human spirit. He was the perfect embodiment of what humanity could bring to the fight. As David prepared to lead his squadron, he knew the task ahead was daunting. He would command soldiers of vastly different races, each with their own culture, strengths, and weaknesses. Some, like the fearsome Yither, an insectoid species with exoskeletal armor and venomous claws, were powerful in close combat but lacked the subtlety needed for strategy. Others, like the SKRYTH, a race of telekinetic beings, had immense power but struggled with the harsh realities of warfare outside their homeworld's peaceful environment. But David was no stranger to adversity. His experience on Earth had shaped him, taught him the value of unity in diversity. And now, as he looked over the faces of his new soldiers, he saw a microcosm of humanity itself. He wasn't just leading a military campaign, he was guiding a coalition, a group of beings who had once seen humans as insignificant, now relying on them for hope. "You all know the mission," David spoke to his team, standing before a holographic map of the Zinther Empire's war plans. "We're not here to win by sheer force. We're here to win by outsmarting them. We'll use our differences to our advantage. Where you're strong, I need you. Where you're weak, I'll cover. We fight together, or we fall apart." The crew nodded, some with skepticism, others with hope. David's human resolve was evident, and it inspired trust. It didn't matter if they were born of fire, stone, or stardust. David's words resonated across the disparate group, binding them together in a common cause. The first battle took place on a barren moon on the edge of Zinther-controlled space. David's force, a motley crew of human soldiers, Vorak warlords, Yither shock troops, and SKRYTH psychics, faced an incoming Zinther assault. The moon was a perfect place for the initial test, a world devoid of civilian life but rich with strategic value. If the Zinther could capture it, they would gain a critical foothold in the region. The Zinther soldiers came in waves. their massive ships descending from the sky with thunderous force. Their ground forces were as vicious as ever, armored titans who relied on their overwhelming strength and numbers. But David had a plan. Instead of meeting the Zinthar head-on in a direct assault, David's forces used stealth, traps, and guerrilla tactics. The SKRYTH psychics infiltrated the enemy's command center, disrupting their strategies with psychic blasts that left the Zinthar commanders confused and disoriented. The Ythar, with their keen sense of smell and night vision, moved swiftly through the darkness, ambushing Zinthar soldiers with deadly precision. David's human soldiers were the glue that held it all together. While not as physically imposing as the other species, their adaptability and creativity were unparalleled. They set explosive traps, lured Zinthar forces into ambushes, and created chaos that left the invaders off balance. But the turning point came when David himself led a small team into the heart of the Zinthar stronghold. While the main force kept the enemy distracted, David and his squad infiltrated the heavily fortified command center. They disabled the communication systems and sent false orders back to the Zinthar fleet, causing confusion and disarray. It wasn't long before the Zinthar were forced to retreat, their carefully laid plans shattered. The victory was swift, decisive, and the first major defeat the Zinthar had suffered in years. The Galactic Council, stunned by the outcome, was forced to re-evaluate humanity's role in the war. The message was clear: humans were not just survivors, they were strategists, problem solvers, and leaders. David's reputation grew, not just as a soldier but as a tactician who understood that the true strength of humanity didn't lie in brute force. It lay in the human mind, its capacity to adapt, to think outside the box, to push through adversity, and to fight with an unyielding spirit when the odds seemed impossible. The Zinthar would not be defeated easily, but humanity had proven that no matter how far they were pushed, they could always rise again. And this time, the galaxy knew it wasn't just a matter of physical strength, it was the strength of the human will that would change the course of the war. David Miller had shown them that true strength wasn't just in power, it was in the heart, the determination, and the courage to stand up when no one else would. And that was something no alien race could ever replicate. Mocked by aliens, the human recruit proved what true strength is. A HFY, Sci-Fi Stories, Part 3. The battle on the barren moon was only the beginning. The Zinthar Empire, though defeated in that skirmish, had not forgotten the humiliation. Their leaders vowed to crush the human-led coalition, to demonstrate once and for all that no matter the tactics, no matter the ingenuity, nothing could stand against the might of their empire. But the galaxy had already begun to change. With each victory, humanity's influence grew stronger. David Miller's reputation spread like wildfire, and more species began to see what humans brought to the table. They weren't the weakest link, they were the spark that could ignite the fire of rebellion across the galaxy. The council called for another meeting, a strategy session that would determine their next move in the war. It was to take place aboard the Astronova, the flagship of the unified coalition. The ship was a marvel of engineering, combining the best technologies from every species in the coalition, and it served as the nerve center for the war effort. David had come a long way since his first trial by combat. He was no longer just a recruit. He was a commander, a leader of diverse species united under one banner. He had earned the respect of the council, and though there were still skeptics among them, the tides were shifting in favor of humanity. The war had become a series of hit-and-run skirmishes, each more dangerous than the last. The Zinthar Empire was growing more aggressive, and their tactics were evolving. They no longer underestimated their human adversaries, and they had started to employ psychological warfare, attempting to break the resolve of the coalition. David stood before the council, his eyes scanning the faces of the various alien species. There were the Vorik, their large, muscular forms a stark contrast to his own slender human frame. The Ythar, with their mandibles clicking in the silence, their insectoid eyes fixed on him with curiosity. The SKRYTH, hovering silently in their ethereal forms, their telekinetic powers always a wild card. And the Phylaxians, beings of pure energy, their glowing forms flickering with uncertainty. "We need to hit them where it hurts," David said, his voice steady and calm. "We can't fight them in a traditional sense. They'll outnumber us and outgun us. But we can cripple their supply lines, target their fleet commanders, and take away their ability to sustain this war." Zalrith, The insectoid representative who had mocked David in the beginning raised a skeptical eyebrow. You propose sabotage and disruption as our strategy? How will that lead us to victory? David met his gaze without hesitation. We hit them in the places they're weakest. Their arrogance, their overconfidence. They think their fleet is invincible, that their numbers make them unbeatable. But they've underestimated our ability to adapt. The room was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the first time David had suggested unconventional tactics, but each time, his ideas had proven effective. The council members exchanged glances, some uncertain, others beginning to see the logic in his words. A Phylaxian delegate, who had been silent until now, spoke. The Zinthar are relying on their fleets to maintain control. If we can fracture their command structure, they will be forced into disarray. This strategy might have merit. David nodded. Exactly. We're not going to win by sheer force. We're going to outsmart them, disrupt their plans, and force them to waste resources chasing us. We'll take the fight to their homeworld. The room erupted in murmurs. The idea was bold, dangerous even, but David's success had earned him enough credibility that many were willing to follow him into this uncertain path. The Phylaxian spoke again. We shall provide our technology to aid in your sabotage efforts. The Zinthar rely heavily on their energy networks. If you can infiltrate their energy grid, you will cripple their fleet's ability to move. Zalrith added. The Yithar are known for their stealth and ambush tactics. We can help sabotage their supply lines, cut off their reinforcements. David smiled. The pieces were falling into place. Then it's settled. We make our move. Weeks passed as the coalition gathered its forces. The Zinthar Empire had underestimated the resolve of the human-led alliance. They thought the tactics David used were a fluke, but now they were learning that the humans had a gift for guerrilla warfare, deception, and creating chaos in the ranks of even the most disciplined of enemies. David's team infiltrated one of the Zinthar's largest military outposts on a planet called Zorith Prime, the heart of their fleet production. It was a heavily guarded facility, bristling with defensive weapons and shielded from orbital strikes. But David had a plan. The SKRYTH provided the psychic cover, infiltrating the Zinthar's minds and leaving them in a state of confusion. The Vorik, with their immense strength, broke through walls and created diversions that allowed the human soldiers to slip past enemy lines. The Yithar, expert trackers, set explosive charges along key supply routes, ensuring that Zinthar reinforcements could never arrive on time. David himself led a small team to the central command tower. There, they planted the final bomb, one that would wipe out the heart of the Zinthar's military communications. The entire facility would be rendered blind, unable to coordinate a defense against the coalition's next wave of attacks. But as they were preparing to leave, disaster struck. The Zinthar were more prepared than they had anticipated, and a platoon of elite soldiers ambushed them in the corridors. David's squad fought valiantly, but the Zinthar were relentless. In the chaos, one of David's team, a young human soldier named Corporal Sarah Klein, was wounded badly. She was pinned down, surrounded by Zinthar troops, and with no way to escape. David knew what he had to do. There was no time for hesitation. He signaled to his team, then charged forward, taking out a Zinthar with a well-placed shot. His heart raced as he fought his way through the enemies, finally reaching Sarah. "Get up, Klein," David shouted over the roar of battle. "We're getting out of here." With one final push, David dragged Sarah to safety, even as their escape route was rapidly collapsing around them. They barely made it to the transport ship as the facility exploded behind them, the entire structure going up in flames. Back aboard the Astronova, the council watched in stunned silence as the reports came in. The Zinthar outpost was obliterated, their fleet's production crippled, and their command center destroyed. But the cost had been high. David had lost soldiers, and the Zinthar were now desperate. Still, David stood before them, unbroken. "This is just the beginning. The Zinthar will fight harder now, but we've shown them they can't win by sheer force. They'll never be able to predict our next move." The council members exchanged looks. They had seen what David had accomplished, not through might, but through strategy, courage, and unity. Humanity had proven something undeniable. They were not to be underestimated. David had proved again that true strength was not in brute force, but in the will to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The Zinthar would learn this lesson the hard way. And as the war raged on, David Miller's name would become synonymous with hope, a symbol of what one human, against all odds, could achieve when they refused to back down. Mocked by aliens, the human recruit proved what true strength is. HFY, Sci-Fi Stories, Part 4. The war against the Zinther Empire had escalated into a full-scale conflict, with each side pouring every resource they had into the fight. The Coalition's victory on Zorith Prime had dealt a crippling blow to the Zinther's military infrastructure, but it also galvanized the Empire's resolve. They retaliated with brutal force, launching counteroffensives that left entire worlds in ashes. Every victory for the Coalition seemed to come at a high cost, and the stakes were growing higher. But amidst the carnage, one name became a beacon of hope for the galaxy: David Miller. No longer just a human recruit, he had become a symbol of resilience and tactical brilliance. His strategies were now a cornerstone of the Coalition's efforts, and his leadership was something the Zinther could no longer ignore. The Council of Species had grown to trust David's instincts, but as the war dragged on, even his unwavering optimism began to waver. He had seen too much death, too many lives lost in the pursuit of peace. The Zinther, relentless in their conquest, seemed to grow more monstrous with every attack, pushing the Coalition to its breaking point. David stood on the bridge of the Astronova, staring out into the vast expanse of space. He had just received word that another world, Belarus, had fallen to the Zinther. The colony there had been a symbol of the Coalition's unity, a peaceful world where humans and aliens coexisted. Now, it was a burning husk, its inhabitants massacred, its cities reduced to rubble. His mind raced. The war was shifting, and he could feel it, could sense that the Zinther were evolving, adapting to their losses. They had grown stronger, more cunning. Every time they suffered a defeat, they returned with a new, deadly strategy. It was becoming clear to David that the Zinther Empire was no longer fighting for conquest. They were fighting to break the Coalition's spirit. "You can't let them break you, Miller." A voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see General Vera, a Vorak warlord who had fought beside him since the early days of the war. Vera was massive, her body encased in thick, battle-worn armor, but her eyes, wise and sharp, showed the depth of her understanding. David smiled, though it was a weary, tired expression. "I'm not the one they need to break. It's everyone else. The longer this war drags on, the more the Council will start to question their investment in this fight." Vera grunted, crossing her arms. "You're too hard on yourself. You've proven the worth of humanity time and time again. There's a reason why they listen to you now." David shook his head. "I'm just one man, but sometimes, I feel like that's all that's left of us. If we can't win this war soon, we'll lose everything we've fought for." Vera stepped closer, placing a massive hand on his shoulder. "Then you'll do what you've always done, Miller. You'll find a way." A few days later, the Council gathered for an emergency meeting aboard the Astronova. The Zinther had launched a major offensive, an attack on the heart of the Coalition's operations, a strategic world known as Arndr, where many species fleets were stationed. If Arndr fell, it would be the end of the Coalition's ability to respond to the Zinther threat. It was the final line in the sand. David walked into the Council chamber, his mind already racing with plans and contingencies. His heart ached at the thought of losing more innocent lives. But he knew this was a pivotal moment. If the Coalition failed here, all hope for the galaxy would be lost. "David Miller," said Zalrith, the Yither representative, his insectoid face grim, "we have received word that the Zinther fleet is headed toward Arndr. They will arrive within the hour." "I know," David said, taking his seat at the table. His voice was firm, unwavering. "But we're not going to meet them head-on. Not this time." A murmur of confusion rippled through the Council. "What do you mean?" General Vera asked, her tone cautious. "We don't have the luxury of a surprise attack anymore. They know we're coming." David paused, studying the map projected before him. The Zinther fleet was vast, stretching across the space lanes, and Arndr's defenses were formidable. But there was a weakness, an opening, one that they could exploit. "We won't fight them in the traditional sense. We're going to use their own arrogance against them." The plan was risky, but David had seen it work before. The Zinther believed they were invincible, and that belief made them predictable. They had always relied on brute force, on overwhelming numbers, and on crushing their opponents in direct combat. But David knew the Zinther were vulnerable to one thing: their inability to adapt quickly when faced with an unconventional strategy. The coalition would not engage the Zinther fleet directly. Instead, they would create a series of false leads and false battles across several key star systems, each one designed to make the Zinther believe the coalition was disorganized, disjointed, and desperate. Meanwhile, the real strike force, led by David and his closest allies, would slip past the Zinther's defenses, using their advanced stealth technology and guerrilla tactics to infiltrate Arnder's planetary shield generators. The plan was simple: disable the Zinther's shields, allowing the rest of the coalition fleet to strike when the enemy was least prepared. David's heart raced as the operation commenced. The first phase of the plan was unfolding perfectly. The Zinther fleet split its forces to chase after false signals, stretching its resources thin. The decoys worked like a charm. The Zinther, confident in their strength, believed they had the upper hand. It wasn't until David's strike team had infiltrated Arnder's atmosphere that the Empire realized something was wrong. The final phase of the operation hinged on the success of David's team. They would need to disable the planetary shield generators, located deep within the Zinther stronghold on Arnder. Once the shields fell, the fleet would move in and finish the job. But failure meant death, not just for David and his team, but for every living creature in the galaxy. As they descended through Arnder's atmosphere, David felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him. He knew the stakes. This was the coalition's last chance. If the Zinther held the planet, the war would continue, and humanity's survival would be uncertain. The ship's alarms blared as they neared the target. "We're almost there, David." Corporal Klein's voice crackled through his calm. "We've got a window of about 10 minutes before reinforcements arrive." David nodded, glancing at his team: Human, Vorak, Yther, Skryth, and Phylaxian. They were ready. The planet's fate rested in their hands. The ground shook as they touched down, and the team stormed the Zinther stronghold. The battle was fierce, but David's strategy was clear. They fought not to overpower, but to outsmart, creating chaos within the Zinther ranks. The shields would fall, and when they did, the coalition fleet would arrive to finish what had begun. Hours later, David stood on the bridge of the Astronova, watching as the Zinther fleet crumbled. The shield generators had been disabled, and the combined might of the coalition had torn through the remnants of the Empire's forces. The tide had turned. The war was not over, but the Zinther had been dealt a blow they could never recover from. The galaxy had witnessed the full power of human ingenuity, unity, and determination. David knew there was more to be done, more battles to fight, more victories to win, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that humanity had a future in this galaxy, a future they had earned. Mocked by aliens, the human recruit proved what true strength is. A HFY, Sci-Fi Stories, Part 5. The war against the Zinther Empire was over, but its echoes reverberated through the galaxy. The coalition of species had emerged victorious, their enemies shattered, their cities burned to the ground. The galaxy was on the brink of a new age, a time for rebuilding, for healing, and for reflection. But the scars of war were deep, and even in victory, the price had been high. David Miller, the human who had once been mocked by the galaxy's most powerful species, stood on the bridge of the Astronova, looking out at the distant stars. The war was over, but the work had only just begun. The galaxy was in ruins, and it would take more than military might to bring about true peace. It would take something else: the same resilience, the same spirit of unity, and the same courage that had carried them through the war. But as he looked out across the stars, David knew the cost had been steep. Allies had fallen, planets had burned, and whole populations had been decimated. Even in victory, there were no real winners. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would he. "You've done it, Miller." General Vera's voice cut through the silence. The massive Vorak warrior approached, her battle-worn armor clinking as she moved. "The Zinther Empire is finished. We've won." David nodded, his face somber. "Yes, we've won. But at what cost?" Vera's eyes softened. "War is always costly, but you've shown everyone what humanity is capable of, what we are capable of. You've taught us that we can win, not just by strength, but by our will, by our ingenuity. The Zinther thought they could crush us, but they never understood the strength of our resolve." David's gaze drifted back to the vast expanse of space. He thought of the soldiers who had died for this victory, the human and alien soldiers, all equally important, all equally brave. He thought of Corporal Klein, who had nearly died in the battle to disable the planetary shields. She had survived, but many hadn't. So many had fallen in the fight for freedom. We didn't win this war alone, Vera, David said quietly. It was a coalition, and we all sacrificed. No one group was stronger than the other. That's why we won. Vera tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. Perhaps that is why the Zinthar never understood us. They saw themselves as the superior race, the ones with the strength to dominate. But we beat them with something they never could fathom, unity. The rebuilding efforts were immense. Entire fleets of ships and cargo transports were dispatched to the war-torn planets to deliver aid, medical supplies, and technology. Species that had once viewed each other as enemies worked together to restore order and peace to the shattered galaxy. The coalition was no longer just a military alliance, it was a community, a testament to what could be achieved when species set aside their differences and worked toward a common goal. David Miller had become a hero, a symbol of hope and resilience. But he wasn't interested in the accolades. He didn't need to be lauded for his efforts. The real victory wasn't in the praise, it was in the new relationships that had been forged, the new alliances that had emerged. The real victory was in the peace that was slowly taking root across the galaxy. But there were still challenges ahead. There were remnants of the Zinthar Empire scattered across the galaxy, rogue factions that refused to accept the new order, and not all species in the coalition were content with the newfound peace. There were those who wanted revenge, who felt the scars of war could only be healed through retribution. David knew the temptation for vengeance was strong, but he also knew that it would only lead to more destruction. The Zinthar Empire had been beaten, but peace was fragile, and it would require careful negotiation, trust, and patience to maintain. He had already begun working with the Council to form a new governing body, one that would bring together representatives from every species, ensuring that no one group would dominate the others. It was a delicate balance, and David was committed to making it work. Months passed, and the galaxy began to recover. Planets once in ruins began to flourish again, their people rebuilding their homes and societies. Trade routes were reopened, and the galaxy slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. David, now a permanent fixture in the Council, continued to work tirelessly, pushing for diplomacy, peace, and cooperation. One day, as he sat in a meeting discussing the next steps for the rebuilding efforts, an unexpected transmission came through. It was a message from an unknown source, encrypted and highly classified. The message was brief but chilling. "We are watching you, human. This war is far from over." David's heart skipped a beat. He had expected there would be more challenges, residual factions, rogue groups, but this message, this threat, was something different, something far more ominous. The voice on the transmission continued, cold and mechanical. "You may have defeated the Zinthar, but their allies are many, and they will come for you." David stood before the Council once more, his face grim. The threat was real. The Zinthar Empire might have been destroyed, but its allies were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. And this time, they might be more organized, more dangerous. "We've made great strides," David said, his voice firm, "but this galaxy isn't at peace yet. We've defeated one threat, but there are still those who would see us fall. Our unity will be tested again." He looked around the room at the faces of the Council, humans, Vorak, Ythir, Skryth, Phylaxians, and saw the same resolve he had seen in them during the war. They were ready to face whatever new threat emerged, together. And then, with a calm determination, David spoke the words that had carried him through every trial, every battle, every loss. "We've proven before that we are stronger when we stand together, and we will prove it again." As the message ended and the Council went to work on the next phase of their plans, David walked out of the room, his mind already working on the new challenges ahead. The peace they had fought for was still fragile, but it was theirs to protect. The galaxy was at a crossroads, and David Miller had become more than just a symbol of hope. He had become the embodiment of what it meant to fight for a better future. The war had changed him, had tested his limits and his courage. But through it all, he had learned one thing above all else: true strength didn't come from power or numbers. It came from the unwavering belief that no matter the odds, No matter the obstacles, there was always hope, and as long as there was hope, humanity, along with all the species who had joined in the fight, could overcome anything. The stars were still out there, waiting, and David Miller would always be ready to protect them. Mocked by aliens, the human recruit proved what true strength is. HFY, Sci-Fi Stories, Part 6. The message from the unknown source had shaken the fragile peace that had settled over the galaxy. David Miller had always known that peace was not something that could be taken for granted. But the threat looming just beyond the horizon was more than just an isolated incident. It was a warning, one that could shake the very foundations of the coalition. The weeks after the transmission were filled with tense diplomacy, as the Council scrambled to decode the message and assess its implications. Was it a rogue faction of the Zinther, a new enemy, or perhaps something even worse? There were too many possibilities, and every scenario seemed to lead back to one central truth: the galaxy was not as safe as everyone had hoped. David's role in the Council had grown more significant than ever. He had once been a lowly recruit, laughed at and underestimated by the very species he now worked alongside. But the war had changed everything. His strategies, his decisions, his ability to unite disparate species, these were no longer just strengths. They were essential to the survival of the galaxy. As David walked through the Council's expansive war room aboard the Astronova, he felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He had spent countless hours working with diplomats and military leaders, trying to forge a lasting peace and make sure that the galaxy didn't slip back into chaos. But now, the shadow of a new threat loomed, and he knew that his next steps would be critical. "The Council is ready for you, Commander." General Vera's voice broke through his thoughts. The massive Vorak warrior stood at the entrance, her helmet tucked under her arm. Her expression was unreadable, but David could see the tension in her posture. David gave a brief nod. "Let's get this over with." The Council room was filled with representatives from every corner of the galaxy. The air was thick with anticipation, the quiet hum of the ship's engines vibrating beneath their feet. It was here, in this very room, where the fate of the galaxy would be decided. The coalition had managed to stand together in the face of the Zinther Empire's tyranny. But this new threat, whatever it was different. The Council members, though united in the past, knew that they would need to dig deeper, to rely on something stronger than their previous alliances if they were to survive what was coming. David stood at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his allies. "I know you've all been briefed on the transmission. We don't know who sent it or who is behind it. But we do know this: the Zinther are not gone. Their empire may have crumbled, but their influence still lingers. And there are factions out there, alien species, power-hungry groups, that want to take advantage of the power vacuum." Zalrith, the Yither representative, his insectoid face etched with concern, spoke first. "This is troubling. We've made great strides toward peace, and now, this threat could undo all of it. But we cannot assume it's only the remnants of the Zinther. There are many enemies who may wish to test our resolve." David nodded grimly. "Exactly. We cannot let our guard down. This galaxy has fought too hard to get here, and we will not lose it to another war." Vera stepped forward, her massive frame casting a shadow over the Council table. "What do you propose, Commander?" David's eyes flicked to the star charts on the wall, showing the various territories that were once part of the Zinther Empire. Some of them were quiet, calm even. Others, however, were marked with flashing red lights, symbols of instability. "We need to expand our intelligence network. We need to find out who's behind this threat before they strike. We also need to strengthen our borders and prepare for any potential incursions." "But," General Vera interjected, "if we begin fortifying our worlds, we risk sending the message that we're afraid, that we're divided." David met her gaze, his voice steady. "We are not divided. We are prepared. We have to be. If we don't act now, if we don't show the galaxy that we are ready to defend the peace we've fought for, then we risk giving in to fear." The room was silent for a long moment. Every species in the room had suffered under the shadow of war, had lost friends and family to the Zinther's cruelty. But they had won. They had stood together, and now they faced a new test. Finally, the SKRYTH representative, a species of crystalline beings who had been silent until now, spoke up. "You are right. We must prepare. We must find out who these enemies are and make sure they know that we will not yield. If they wish to challenge us, Let them come. A murmur of agreement swept through the council. One by one, each representative voiced their support for David's plan. It was unanimous. The galaxy would not crumble in the face of uncertainty. The coalition had survived before, and it would survive again. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. David had coordinated with every corner of the coalition, strengthening old alliances and forging new ones. Intelligence agents were dispatched to track down the source of the transmission, while military forces began to fortify key strategic points across the galaxy. But the longer they waited for answers, the more unsettled David became. The galaxy was on edge, and rumors of an impending attack spread like wildfire. Every day brought a new whisper, talk of strange ships seen in deep space, of covert movements from previously neutral factions, and of a growing resistance that no one had seen coming. One evening, as David reviewed reports in his quarters aboard the Astronova, a new transmission came through, this time, a direct link to his ship. The message was encoded, but David's experience with Zinther encryption allowed him to crack it quickly. The voice that came through was cold, mechanical, yet somehow familiar. You should have never won. Human, the galaxy is not yours to command. David's heart raced as the transmission continued. We will not forgive what you have done. We are coming, and this time, you will not survive. The message cut off abruptly, leaving David staring at the screen, his mind racing. It was clear now, this wasn't a rogue faction or a few scattered enemies. This was a well-organized force, one with the resources and the will to strike. David stood, his mind already formulating a plan. There was no time to waste. He needed to act, and he needed to act fast. This wasn't just a threat, it was an ultimatum. The next few days were a blur of activity as David and the council prepared for the worst. He knew that whatever was coming, it would be unlike anything they had faced before. But he also knew something else. They had faced impossible odds before and had emerged victorious. Now, once again, it would come down to one thing, the strength of their unity. And if the enemies of peace thought they could break the coalition, they would learn the hard way that David Miller and his allies had learned something the Zinther never could. True strength came not from power, but from the bonds forged in the heat of battle, from the courage to rise again, and from the will to stand against those who sought to tear the galaxy apart. As the preparations for the coming conflict began in earnest, David looked once more at the stars. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The galaxy had already proven its strength. Now, it was time to show the universe what humanity and the coalition could truly do. They had already proven that nothing could break them. And they would prove it again.